Chapter 2, Part 3 of The Outline of Science. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Outline of Science, Volume 1, by J. Arthur Thomson. Chapter 2, Part 3, The Procession of Life Through the Ages. The Rock Record. How do we know when the various classes of animals and plants were established on the earth? How do we know the order of their appearance and the succession of their advances? The answer is by reading the rock record. In the course of time, the crust of the earth has been elevated into continents and depressed into ocean troughs, and the surface of the land has been buckled up into mountain ranges and folded in gentler hills and valleys. The high places of the land have been weathered by air and water in many forms, and the results of the weathering have been borne away by rivers and seas, to be laid down again elsewhere as deposits which eventually formed sandstones, mudstones, and similar sedimentary rocks. Much of the material of the original crust has been thus broken down and worked up again many times over, and if the total thickness of the sedimentary rocks is added up, it amounts, according to some geologists, to a total of 67 miles. In most cases, however, only a small part of this thickness is to be seen in one place, for the deposits were usually formed in limited areas at any one time. The use of fossils. When the sediments were accumulating age after age, it naturally came about that remains of the plants and animals living at the time were buried, and these formed the fossils by the aid of which it is possible to read the story of the past. By careful piecing together of evidence, the geologist is able to determine the order in which the different sedimentary rocks were laid down, and thus to say, for instance, that the Devonian period was the time of the origin of amphibians. In other cases, the geologist utilizes the fossils in his attempt to work out the order of the strata when these have been much disarranged. For the simpler fossil forms of any type must be older than those that are more complex. There is no vicious circle here, for the general succession of strata is clear, and it is quite certain that there were fishes before there were amphibians, and amphibians before there were reptiles, and reptiles before there were birds and mammals. In certain cases, for instance of fossil horses and elephants, the actual historical succession has been clearly worked out. If the successive strata contained good samples of all the plants and animals living at the time when the beds were formed, then it would be easy to read the record of the rocks. But many animals were too soft to become satisfactory fossils, many were eaten or dissolved away, many were destroyed by heat and pressure, so that the rock record is like a library very much damaged by fire and looting and decay. The geological timetable. The long history of the earth and its inhabitants is conveniently divided into eras. Thus, just as we speak of the ancient, medieval, and modern history of mankind, so we may speak of Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras in the history of the earth as a whole. Geologists cannot tell us, except in an approximate way, how long the process of evolution has taken. One of the methods is to estimate how long has been required for the accumulation of the salts of the sea, for all these have been dissolved out of rocks since rain began to fall on the earth. Dividing the total amount of saline matter by what is contributed every year in modern times, we get about 100 million years as the age of the sea. But as the present rate of salt accumulation is probably much greater than it was during many of the geological periods, the prodigious age just mentioned is in all likelihood far below the mark. Another method is to calculate how long it would take to form the sedimentary rocks, like sandstones and mudstones, which have a total thickness of over 50 miles, though the local thickness is rarely over a mile. As most of the materials have come from the weathering of the earth's crust, and as the annual amount of weathering now going on can be estimated, the time required for the formation of the sedimentary rocks of the world can be approximately calculated. There are some other ways of trying to tell the Earth's age and the length of the successive periods, but no certainty has been reached. The eras marked on the table as before the Cambrian correspond to about 32 miles of thickness of strata, and all the subsequent eras with fossil-bearing rocks to a thickness of about 21 miles, in itself an astounding fact. Perhaps 30 million years must be allotted to the Precambrian eras, 18 to the Paleozoic, 9 to the Mesozoic, 3 to the Cenozoic, making a grand total of 60 million. The establishment of invertebrate stocks. It is an astounding fact that at least half of the geological time, the Archeozoic and Proterozoic eras, passed before there were living creatures with parts sufficiently hard to form fossils. In the latter part of the Proterozoic era there are traces of one-celled marine animals, radiolarians, with shells of flint, and of worms that wallowed in the primal mud. It is plain that as regards the most primitive creatures, the rock record tells us little. The rarity of direct traces of life in the oldest rocks is partly due to the fact that the primitive animals would be of delicate build, but it must also be remembered that the ancient rocks have been profoundly and repeatedly changed by pressure and heat, so that the traces which did exist would be very liable to obliteration. And if it be asked what right we have to suppose the presence of living creatures in the absence or extreme rarity of fossils, we must point to great accumulations of limestone which indicate the existence of calcareous algae, and to deposits of iron, which probably indicate the activity of iron-forming bacteria. Ancient beds of graphite similarly suggest that green plants flourished in these ancient days. The era of ancient life, Paleozoic. The Cambrian period was the time of the establishment of the chief stocks of backboneless animals such as sponges, jellyfishes, worms, sea cucumbers, lamp shells, trilobites, crustaceans, and mollusks. There is something very elegant in the broad fact that the peopling of the seas had definitely begun some 30 million years ago, for Professor H. F. Osborn points out that in the Cambrian period there was already a colonization of the shore of the sea, the open sea, and the deep waters. The Ordovician period was marked by abundant representation of the once very successful class of trilobites, joint-footed, antenna-bearing, segmented marine animals, with numerous appendages and a covering of chitin. They died away entirely with the end of the Paleozoic era. Also very notable was the abundance of predatory cuttlefishes, the bullies of the ancient seas. But it was in this period that the first backboned animals made their appearance, an epoch-making step in evolution. In other words, true fishes were evolved, destined in the course of ages to replace the cuttlefishes, which are mere mollusks, in dominating the seas. Here is a breakdown of geological times from the most recent to the most ancient. First is called the Cenozoic era, and it is divided into several times. The most recent is the Pleistocene or glacial time, which was the time of the last great ice age. Before that were the Miocene and Pliocene times, which saw the emergence of man, and before them the Eocene and Oligocene times, which saw the rise of higher mammals. Prior to the Cenozoic era was the Mesozoic era, with three periods, the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and Triassic periods, in order from most recent to most ancient. The Cretaceous period saw the rise of primitive mammals, flowering plants, and higher insects. The Jurassic period, the rise of birds and flying reptiles. The Triassic period, the rise of dinosaur reptiles. Before the Mesozoic era was the Paleozoic era, divided into 6 periods. From most recent to most ancient, they are the Permian, the Carboniferous, the Devonian, the Silurian, the Ordovician, and the Cambrian periods. The Permian period saw the rise of reptiles. The Carboniferous period, the rise of insects. The Devonian period, our first amphibians. The Silurian period, land animals began. The Ordovician period, our first fishes. The Cambrian period saw the peopling of the sea. Before the Paleozoic era came the Proterozoic ages, where many of the backboneless stocks began, and prior to that were the Archaeozoic ages, where living creatures began to be upon the earth. Before that we recognize what we call the formative times. During this period were the makings of continents and ocean basins, the beginnings of an atmosphere and hydrosphere, the cooling of the earth, and the establishment of the solar system. In the Silurian period, in which the peopling of the seas went on apace, there was the first known attempt at colonizing the dry land. For in Silurian rocks there are fossil scorpions, and that implies ability to breathe dry air by means of internal surfaces, in this case known as lung books. It was also towards the end of the Silurian, when a period of great aridity set in, that fishes appeared related to our mudfishes or double breathers, the dipnoi, which have lungs as well as gills. This again meant utilizing dry air, just as the present-day mudfishes do when the water disappears from the pools in hot weather. The lungfishes or mudfishes of today are but 3 in number, one in Queensland, one in South America, and one in Africa, but they are extremely interesting living fossils, binding the class of fishes to that of amphibians. It is highly probable that the first invasion of the dry land should be put to the credit of some adventurous worms, but the second great invasion was certainly due to air-breathing arthropods like the pioneer scorpion we mentioned. The Devonian period, including that of the Old Red Sandstone, was one of the most significant periods in the Earth's history, for it was the time of the establishment of flowering plants upon the Earth and of terrestrial backboned animals. One would like to have been the discoverer of the Devonian footprint of Thinopus, the first known amphibian footprint, an eloquent vestige of the third great invasion of the dry land. It was probably from a stock of Devonian lungfishes that the first amphibians sprang, but it was not till the next period that they came to their own. While they were still feeling their way, there was a remarkable exuberance of shark-like and heavily armored fishes in the Devonian seas. Evolution of land animals, giant amphibians, and coal measures. The Carboniferous period was marked by a mild, moist climate and a luxuriant vegetation in the swampy low grounds. It was a much less strenuous time than the Devonian period. It was like a very long summer. There were no trees of the type we see now, but there were forests of club mosses and horsetails which grew to a gigantic size compared with their pygmy representatives of today. In these forests the joint-footed invaders of the dry land ran riot in the form of centipedes, spiders, scorpions, and insects, and on these the primeval amphibians fed. The appearance of insects made possible a new linkage of far-reaching importance, namely, the cross-fertilization of flowering plants by their insect visitors, and from this time onwards it may be said that flowers and their visitors have evolved hand in hand. Cross-fertilization is much surer by insects than by the wind, and cross-fertilization is more advantageous than self-fertilization, because it promotes both fertility and plasticity. It was probably in this period that colored flowers, attractive to insect visitors, began to justify themselves as beauty became useful, and began to relieve the monotonous green of the horsetail and club moss forests, which covered great tracts of the earth for millions of years. In the Carboniferous forest there were also land snails, representing one of the minor invasions of the dry land, tending on the whole to check vegetation. They too were probably preyed upon by the amphibians, some of which attained a large size. Each age has had its giants, and those of the Carboniferous were amphibians called labyrinthodonts, some of which were almost as big as donkeys. It need hardly be said that it was in this period that most of the coal measures were laid down by the immense accumulation of the spores and debris of the club moss forests. Ages afterwards it was given to man to tap this great source of energy, traceable back to the sunshine of millions of years ago. Even then it was true that no plant or animal lives or dies to itself. The acquisitions of amphibians. As amphibians had their golden age in the Carboniferous period, we may fitly use this opportunity of indicating the advances in evolution which the emergence of amphibians implied. 1. In the first place, the passage from water to dry land was the beginning of a higher and more promiseful life, taxed no doubt by increased difficulties. The natural question rises why animals should have migrated from water to dry land at all, when great difficulties were involved in the transition. The answers must be A. That local drying up of water basins or elevations of the land surface often made the old haunts untenable. B. That there may have been great congestion and competition in the old quarters. And C. That there has been an undeniable endeavor after well-being throughout the history of animal life. In the same way with mankind, migrations were prompted by the setting in of prolonged drought, by overpopulation, and by the spirit of adventure. 2. In amphibians, for the first time, the non-digitate paired fins of fishes were replaced by limbs with fingers and toes. This implied an advantageous power of grasping, of holding firm, of putting food into the mouth, of feeling things in 3 dimensions. 3. We cannot be positive in regard to the soft parts of the ancient amphibians known only as fossils, but if they were in a general way like the frogs and toads, newts and salamanders of the present day, we may say that they made among other acquisitions the following: true ventral lungs, a 3-chambered heart, a movable tongue, a drum to the ear, and lids to the eyes. It is very interesting to find that though the tongue of the tadpole has some muscle fibers in it, they are not strong enough to effect movement, recalling the tongue of fishes, which has not any muscles at all. Gradually, as the tadpole becomes a frog, the muscle fibers grow in strength and make it possible for the full-grown creature to shoot out its tongue upon insects. This is probably a recapitulation of what was accomplished in the course of millennia in the history of the amphibian race. 4. Another acquisition made by amphibians was of voice, due, as in ourselves, to the rapid passage of air over taut membranes, vocal cords, stretched in the larynx. It is an interesting fact that for millions of years there was upon the earth no sound of life at all, only the noise of wind and wave, thunder and avalanche. Apart from the instrumental music of some insects, perhaps beginning in the Carboniferous, the first vital sounds were due to amphibians, and theirs certainly was the first voice, surely one of the great steps in organic evolution. Evolution of the voice. The first use of the voice was probably that indicated by our frogs and toads. It serves as a sex call. That is the meaning of the trumpeting with which frogs herald the spring, and it is often only in the males that the voice is well developed. But if we look forward, past amphibians altogether, we find the voice becoming a maternal call, helping to secure the safety of the young, a use very obvious when young birds squat motionless at the sound of the parent's danger note. Later on, probably, the voice became an infantile call, as when the unhatched crocodile pipes from within the deeply buried egg, signaling to the mother that it is time to be unearthed. Higher still, the voice expresses emotion, as in the song of birds, often outside the limits of the breeding time. Later still, particular sounds become words, signifying particular things or feelings, such as food, danger, home, anger, and joy. Finally, words become a medium of social intercourse, and as symbols help to make it possible for man to reason. The early reptiles. In the Permian period, reptiles appeared, or perhaps one should say, began to assert themselves. That is to say, there was an emergence of backboned animals which were free from water and relinquished the method of breathing by gills, which amphibians retained in their young stages at least. The unhatched or unborn reptile breathes by means of a vascular hood spread underneath the eggshell and absorbing dry air from without. It is an interesting point that this vascular hood, called the allantois, is represented in the amphibians by an unimportant bladder growing out from the hind end of the food canal. A great step in evolution was implied in the origin of this antenatal hood or fetal membrane, and another one of protective significance called the amnion, which forms a water bag over the delicate embryo. The step meant total emancipation from the water and from gill breathing, and the two fetal membranes, the amnion and the allantois, persist not only in all reptiles but in birds and mammals as well. These higher vertebrates are therefore called amniota, in contrast to the lower vertebrates, or anamnia, the amphibians, fishes, and primitive types. It is a suggestive fact that the embryos of all reptiles, birds, and mammals show gill clefts, a telltale evidence of their distant aquatic ancestry. But these embryonic gill clefts are not used for respiration and show no trace of gills except in a few embryonic reptiles and birds, where their dwindled vestiges have been recently discovered. As to the gill clefts, they are of no use in higher vertebrates, except that the first becomes the eustachian tube, leading from the ear passage to the back of the mouth. The reason why we persist when only one is of any use, and that in a transformed guise, would be difficult to interpret except in terms of the evolution theory. They illustrate the lingering influence of a long pedigree, the living hand of the past, the tendency that individual development has to recapitulate racial evolution. In a condensed and telescoped manner, of course, for what took the race a million years may be recapitulated by the individual in a week. In the Permian period, the warm, moist climate of most of the Carboniferous period was replaced by severe conditions, culminating in an ice age which spread from the southern hemisphere throughout the world. With this was associated a waning of the Carboniferous flora, and the appearance of a new one, consisting of ferns, conifers, ginkgos, and cycads, which persisted until near the end of the Mesozoic era. The Permian Ice Age lasted for millions of years, and was most severe in the far south. Of course, it was a very different world then, for North Europe was joined to North America, Africa to South America, and Australia to Asia. It was probably during the Permian Ice Age that many of the insects divided their life history into two main chapters: the feeding, growing, molting, immature, larval stages, for instance caterpillars, and the more ascetic, non-growing, non-molting, winged phase, adapted for reproduction. Between these there intervened the quiescent, well-protected pupa stage, or chrysalis, probably adapted to begin with as a means of surviving the severe winter, for it is easier for an animal to survive when the vital processes are more or less in abeyance. Disappearance of many ancient types. We cannot leave the last period of the Paleozoic era and its prolonged ice age without noting that it meant the entire cessation of a large number of ancient types, especially among plants and backboneless animals, which now disappear forever. It is necessary to understand that the animals of ancient days stand in three different relations to those of today. A. There are ancient types that have living representatives, sometimes few and sometimes many, sometimes much changed and sometimes but slightly changed. The lamp shell, Lingulella, of the Cambrian and Ordovician period has a very near relative in the Lingula of today. There are a few extremely conservative animals. B. There are ancient types that have no living representatives, except in the guise of transformed descendants, as the king crab, Limulus, may be said to be a transformed descendant of the otherwise quite extinct race to which Eurypterids and sea scorpions belonged. C. There are altogether extinct types, lost races, which have left not a rack behind. For there is not any representation today of such races as graptolites and trilobites. Looking backwards over the many millions of years comprised in the Paleozoic era, what may be emphasized as the most salient features? There was in the Cambrian era the establishment of the chief classes of backboneless animals. In the Ordovician, the first fishes and perhaps the first terrestrial plants. In the Silurian, the emergence of air-breathing invertebrates and mudfishes. In the Devonian, the appearance of the first amphibians, from which all higher land animals are descended, and the establishment of a land flora. In the Carboniferous, the great club moss forests and an exuberance of air-breathing insects and their allies. In the Permian, the first reptiles and a new flora. The geological Middle Ages. The Mesozoic Era. In a broad way, the Mesozoic era corresponds with the golden age of reptiles, and with the climax of the conifer and cycad flora, which was established in the Permian. But among the conifers and cycads, our modern flowering plants were beginning to show face tentatively, just like birds and mammals among the great reptiles. In the Triassic period, the exuberance of reptilian life which marked the Permian was continued. Besides turtles, which still persist, there were ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, dinosaurs, and pterosaurs, none of which lasted beyond the Mesozoic era. Of great importance was the rise of the dinosaurs in the Triassic, for it is highly probable that within the limits of this vigorous and plastic stock, some of them bipeds, we must look for the ancestors of both birds and mammals. Both land and water were dominated by reptiles, some of which attained to gigantic size. Had there been any zoologist in those days, he would have been very sagacious indeed if he had suspected that reptiles did not represent the climax of creation. The flying dragons. The Jurassic period showed a continuance of the reptilian splendor. They radiated in many directions, becoming adapted to many haunts. Thus there were many fish lizards paddling in the seas, many types of terrestrial dragons stalking about on land, many swiftly gliding alligator-like forms, and the flying dragons, which began in the Triassic, attained to remarkable success and variety. Their wing was formed by the extension of a great fold of skin on the enormously elongated outermost finger, and they varied from the size of a sparrow to a spread of over 5 feet. A soldering of the dorsal vertebrae, as in our flying birds, was an adaptation to striking the air with some force, but as there is not more than a slight keel, if any, on the breastbone, it is unlikely that they could fly far. For we know from our modern birds that the power of flight may be to some extent gauged from the degree of development of the keel, which is simply a great ridge for the better insertion of the muscles of flight. It is absent, of course, in the running birds, like the ostrich, and it has degenerated in an interesting way in the burrowing parrot, stringops, and a few other birds that have gone back. The first known bird. But the Jurassic is particularly memorable because its strata have yielded 2 fine specimens of the first known bird, Archaeopteryx. They were entombed in the deposits which form the fine-grained lithographic stones of Bavaria, and practically every bone in the body is preserved except the breastbone. Even the feathers have left their marks with distinctness. This oldest known bird, too far advanced to be the first bird, was about the size of a crow, and was probably of arboreal habits. Of great interest are its reptilian features, so pronounced that one cannot evade the evolutionist suggestion. It had teeth in both jaws, which no modern bird has. It had a long lizard-like tail, which no modern bird has. It had claws on 3 fingers and a sort of half-made wing. That is to say, it does not show, what all modern birds show, a fusion of half the wrist bones with the whole of the palm bones, the well-known carpometacarpus bone, which forms a basis for the longest pinions. In many reptiles, such as crocodiles, there are peculiar bones running across the abdomen beneath the skin, the so-called abdominal ribs, and it seems an eloquent detail to find these represented in Archaeopteryx, the earliest known bird. No modern bird shows any trace of them. There is no warrant for supposing that the flying reptiles or pterodactyls gave rise to birds, for the 2 groups are on different lines, and the structure of the wings is entirely different. Thus the long-fingered pterodactyl wing was a parachute wing, while the secret of the bird's wing has its center in the feathers. It is highly probable that birds evolved from certain dinosaurs which had become bipeds, and it is possible that they were for a time swift runners that took flying jumps along the ground. Thereafter, perhaps, came a period of arboreal apprenticeship, during which there was much gliding from tree to tree before true flight was achieved. It is an interesting fact that the problem of flight has been solved 4 times among animals, by insects, by pterodactyls, by birds, and by bats, and that the 4 solutions are on entirely different lines. In the Cretaceous period, the outstanding events included the waning of giant reptiles, the modernizing of the flowering plants, and the multiplication of small mammals. Some of the Permian reptiles, such as the dog-toothed cynodonts, were extraordinarily mammal-like, and it was probably from among them that definite mammals emerged in the Triassic. Comparatively little is known of the early Triassic mammals, save that their back teeth were marked by numerous tubercles on the crown, but they were gaining strength in the late Triassic when small arboreal insectivores, not very distant from the modern tree shrews, Tupaia, began to branch out in many directions indicative of the great divisions of modern mammals, such as the clawed mammals, hoofed mammals, and the race of monkeys or primates. In the Upper Cretaceous there was an exuberant radiation of mammals, adaptive to the conquest of all sorts of haunts, and this was vigorously continued in Tertiary times. There is no difficulty in the fact that the earliest remains of definite mammals in the Triassic precede the first known bird in the Jurassic. For although we usually rank mammals as higher than birds, being mammals ourselves, how could we do otherwise? There are many ways in which birds are preeminent, for instance in skeleton, musculature, integumentary structures, and respiratory system. The fact is that birds and mammals are on 2 quite different tacks of evolution, not related to one another, save in having a common ancestry in extinct reptiles. Moreover, there is no reason to believe that the Jurassic Archaeopteryx was the first bird in any sense, except that it is the first of which we have any record. In any case, it is safe to say that birds came to their own before mammals did. Looking backwards, we may perhaps sum up what is most essential in the Mesozoic era in Professor Schuchert's sentence. The Mesozoic is the age of reptiles, and yet the little mammals and the toothed birds are storing up intelligence and strength to replace the reptiles when the cycads and conifers shall give way to the higher flowering plants. The Cenozoic or Tertiary era. In the Eocene period, there was a replacement of the small-brained archaic mammals by big-brained, modernized types, and with this must be associated the covering of the earth with a garment of grass and dry pasture. Marshes were replaced by meadows and browsing by grazing mammals. In the spreading meadows, an opportunity was also offered for a richer evolution of insects and birds. During the Oligocene, the elevation of the land continued, the climate became much less moist, and the grazing herds extended their range. The Miocene was the mammalian golden age, and there were crowning examples of what Osborn calls adaptive radiation. That is to say, mammals, like the reptiles before them, conquer every haunt of life. There are flying bats, vol-planing parachutists, climbers in trees like sloths and squirrels, quickly moving hoofed mammals, burrowers like the moles, freshwater mammals like duck mole and beaver, shore-frequenting seals and manatees, and open-sea cetaceans, some of which dive far more than full fathoms 5. It is important to realize the perennial tendency of animals to conquer every corner and to fill every niche of opportunity, and to notice that this has been done by successive sets of animals in succeeding ages. Most notably, the mammals repeat all the experiments of reptiles on a higher turn of the spiral. Thus arises what is called convergence, the superficial resemblance of unrelated types, like whales and fishes, the resemblance being due to the fact that the different types are similarly adapted to similar conditions of life. Professor H. F. Osborn points out that mammals may seek any one of the 12 different habitat zones, and that in each of these there may be 6 quite different kinds of food. Living creatures penetrate everywhere, like the overflowing waters of a great river in flood. The Pliocene period was a more strenuous time, with less genial climatic conditions, and with more intense competition. Old land bridges were broken and new ones made, and the geographical distribution underwent great changes. Professor R. S. Lull describes the Pliocene as a period of great unrest. Many migrations occurred the world over, new competitions arose, and the weaker stocks began to show the effects of the strenuous life. One momentous event seems to have occurred in the Pliocene, and that was the transformation of the precursor of humanity into man, the culmination of the highest line of evolution. The Pleistocene period was a time of sifting. There was a continued elevation of the continental masses, and ice ages set in, relieved by less severe interglacial times when the ice sheets retreated northwards for a time. Many types, like the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the saber-toothed tiger, the cave lion, and the cave bear, became extinct. Others which formerly had a wide range became restricted to the far north, or were left isolated here and there on the high mountains, like the snow mouse, which now occurs on isolated alpine heights above the snow line. Perhaps it was during this period that many birds of the northern hemisphere learned to evade the winter by the sublime device of migration. Looking backwards, we may quote Professor Schuchert again. The lands in the Cenozoic began to bloom with more and more flowering plants and grand hardwood forests. The atmosphere is scented with sweet odors. A vast crowd of new kinds of insects appear, and the places of the once dominant reptiles of the lands and seas are taken by the mammals. Out of these struggles there arises a greater intelligence, seen in nearly all the mammal stocks, but particularly in one, the monkey-ape-man. Brute man appears on the scene with the introduction of the last glacial climate, a most trying time for all things endowed with life, and finally there results the dominance of reasoning man over all his brute associates. In man and human society, the story of evolution has its climax. The ascent of man. Man stands apart from animals in his power of building up general ideas and using these in the guidance of his behavior and the control of his conduct. This is essentially wrapped up with his development of language as an instrument of thought. Some animals have words, but man has language, logos. Some animals show evidence of perceptual inference, but man often gets beyond this to conceptual inference or reason. Many animals are affectionate and brave, self-forgetful and industrious, but man thinks the ought, definitely guiding his conduct in the light of ideals, which in turn are wrapped up with the fact that he is a social person. Besides its big brain, which may be 3 times as heavy as that of a gorilla, man has various physical peculiarities. He walks erect. He plants the sole of his foot flat on the ground. He has a chin and a good heel, a big forehead and a non-protrusive face, a relatively uniform set of teeth without conspicuous canines, and a relatively naked body. But in spite of man's undeniable apartness, there is no doubt as to his solidarity with the rest of creation. There is an all-pervading similitude of structure between man and the anthropoid apes, though it is certain that it is not from any living form that he took his origin. None of the anatomical distinctions, except the heavy brain, could be called momentous. Man's body is a veritable museum of relics, vestigial structures, inherited from pre-human ancestors. In his everyday bodily life and in some of its disturbances, man's pedigree is often revealed. Even his facial expression, as Darwin showed, is not always human. Some fossil remains bring modern man nearer the anthropoid type. It is difficult not to admit the ring of truth in the closing words of Darwin's Descent of Man. Quote, "We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin." End quote. The evolving system of nature. There is another side of evolution so obvious that it is often overlooked, the tendency to link lives together in vital interrelations. Thus flowers and their insect visitors are often vitally interlinked in mutual dependence. Many birds feed on berries and distribute the seeds. The tiny freshwater snail is the host of the juvenile stages of the liver fluke of the sheep. The mosquito is the vehicle of malaria from man to man, and the tsetse fly spreads sleeping sickness. The freshwater mussel cannot continue its race without the unconscious cooperation of the minnow, and the freshwater fish called the bitterling cannot continue its race without the unconscious cooperation of the mussel. There are numerous mutually beneficial partnerships between different kinds of creatures, and other interrelations where the benefit is one-sided, as in the case of insects that make galls on plants. There are also among kindred animals many forms of colonies, communities, and societies. Nutritive chains bind long series of animals together, the cod feeding on the whelk on the worm on the organic dust of the sea. There is a system of successive incarnations, and matter is continually passing from one embodiment to another. These instances must suffice to illustrate the central biological idea of the web of life, the interlinked system of animate nature. Linnaeus spoke of the systema naturae, meaning the orderly hierarchy of classes, orders, families, genera, and species, but we owe to Darwin in particular some knowledge of a more dynamic systema naturae, the network of vital interrelations. This has become more and more complex as evolution has continued, and man's web is most complex of all. It means making animate nature more of a unity. It means an external method of registering steps of progress. It means an evolving set of sieves by which new variations are sifted, and living creatures are kept from slipping down the steep ladder of evolution. Parasitism. It sometimes happens that the interrelation established between one living creature and another works in a retrograde direction. This is the case with many thoroughgoing internal parasites, which have sunk into an easy-going kind of life, utterly dependent on their host for food, requiring no exertions, running no risks, and receiving no spur to effort. Thus we see that evolution is not necessarily progressive. Everything depends on the conditions in reference to which the living creatures have been evolved. When the conditions are too easy-going, the animal may be thoroughly well adapted to them, as a tapeworm certainly is, but it slips down the rungs of the ladder of evolution. This is an interesting minor chapter in the story of evolution, the establishment of different kinds of parasites, casual and constant, temporary and lifelong, eternal hangers-on and internal unpaying boarders, those that live in the food canal and depend on the host's food, and those that inhabit the blood or the tissues and find their food there. It seems clear that ichneumon grubs and the like which hatch inside a caterpillar and eat it alive are not so much parasites as beasts of prey working from within. But there are two sides to this minor chapter. There is the evolution of the parasite, and there is also the evolution of counteractive measures on the part of the host. Thus there is the maintenance of a bodyguard of wandering amoeboid cells, which tackle the microbes invading the body and often succeed in overpowering and digesting them. Thus, again, there is the protective capacity the blood has of making antagonistic substance or antibodies which counteract poisons, including the poisons which the intruding parasites often make. The evidences of evolution, how it came about. Progress in evolution. There has often been slipping back and degeneracy in the course of evolution, but the big fact is that there has been progress. For millions of years, life has been slowly creeping upwards, and if we compare the highest animals, birds and mammals, with their predecessors, we must admit that they are more controlled, more masters of their fate, with more mentality. Evolution is on the whole integrative, that is to say, it makes against instability and disorder and towards harmony and progress. Even in the rise of birds and mammals we can discern that the evolutionary process was making towards a fuller embodiment or expression of what man values most: control, freedom, understanding, and love. The advance of animal life through the ages has been checkered, but on the whole it has been an advance towards increasing fullness, freedom, and fitness of life. In the study of this advance, the central fact of organic evolution, there is assuredly much for man's instruction and much for his encouragement. Evidences of evolution. In all this, it may be said, the fact of evolution has been taken for granted, but what are the evidences? Perhaps it should be frankly answered that the idea of evolution, that the present is the child of the past and the parent of the future, cannot be proved as one may prove the law of gravitation. All that can be done is to show that it is a key, a way of looking at things, that fits the facts. There is no lock that it does not open. But if the facts that the evolution theory vividly interprets be called the evidences of its validity, there is no lack of them. There is historical evidence, and what is more eloquent than the general fact that fishes emerged before amphibians, and these before reptiles, and these before birds, and so on. There are wonderfully complete fossil series, for instance among cuttlefishes, in which we can almost see evolution in process. The pedigree of horse and elephant and crocodile is in general very convincing, though it is to be confessed that there are other cases in regard to which we have no light. Who can tell, for instance, how vertebrates arose or from what origin? There is embryological evidence, for the individual development often reads like an abbreviated recapitulation of the presumed evolution of the race. The mammal's visceral clefts are telltale evidence of remote aquatic ancestors breathing by gills. Something is known in regard to the historical evolution of antlers in bygone ages. The red deer of today recapitulates at least the general outlines of the history. The individual development of an asymmetrical flatfish, like a plaice or sole, which rests and swims on one side, tells us plainly that its ancestors were symmetrical fishes. There is what might be called physiological evidence, for many plants and animals are variable before our eyes, and evolution is going on around us today. This is familiarly seen among domesticated animals and cultivated plants, but there is abundant flux in wild nature. It need hardly be said that some organisms are very conservative, and that change need not be expected when a position of stable equilibrium has been secured. There is also anatomical evidence of a most convincing quality. In the forelimbs of backboned animals, say, the paddle of a turtle, the wing of a bird, the flipper of a whale, the foreleg of a horse, and the arm of a man, the same essential bones and muscles are used to such diverse results. What could it mean save blood relationship? And as to the two sets of teeth in whalebone whales, which never even cut the gum, is there any alternative but to regard them as relics of useful teeth which ancestral forms possessed? In short, the evolution theory is justified by the way in which it works. Factors in evolution. If it be said, so much for the fact of evolution, but what are the factors? The answer is not easy, for not only is the problem the greatest of all scientific problems, but the inquiry is still very young. The scientific study of evolution practically dates from the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. Heritable novelties or variations often crop up in living creatures, and these form the raw material of evolution. These variations are the outcome of expression of changes in the germ cells that develop into organisms. But why should there be changes in the constitution of the germ cells? Perhaps because the living material is very complex and inherently liable to change. Perhaps because it is the vehicle of a multitude of hereditary items, among which there are very likely to be reshufflings or rearrangements. Perhaps because the germ cells have very changeful surroundings, the blood, the body cavity fluid, the seawater. Perhaps because deeply saturating outside influences, such as change of climate and habitat, penetrate through the body to its germ cells and provoke them to vary. But we must be patient with the wearisome reiteration of perhaps. Moreover, every many-celled organism, reproduced in the usual way, arises from an egg cell fertilized by a sperm cell, and the changes involved in and preparatory to this fertilization may make new permutations and combinations of the living items and hereditary qualities not only possible but necessary. It is something like shuffling a pack of cards, but the cards are living. As to the changes wrought on the body during its lifetime by peculiarities in nurture, habits, and surroundings, these dents or modifications are often very important for the individual, but it does not follow that they are directly important for the race, since it is not certain that they are transmissible. Given a crop of variations or new departures or mutations, whatever the inborn novelties may be called, we have then to inquire how these are sifted. The sifting, which means the elimination of the relatively less fit variations and the selection of the relatively more fit, effected in many different ways in the course of the struggle for existence. The organism plays its new card in the game of life, and the consequences may determine survival. The relatively less fit to given conditions will tend to be eliminated, while the relatively more fit will tend to survive. If the variations are hereditary and reappear, perhaps increased in amount, generation after generation, and if the process of sifting continue consistently, the result will be the evolution of the species. The sifting process may be helped by various forms of isolation, which lessen the range of free intercrossing between members of a species, for instance by geographical barriers. Interbreeding of similar forms tends to make a stable stock. Outbreeding among dissimilars tends to promote variability. But for an outline like this, it is enough to suggest the general method of organic evolution. Throughout the ages, organisms have been making tentatives, new departures of varying magnitude, and these tentatives have been tested. The method is that of testing all things and holding fast that which is good. End of chapter 2.